Hello and welcome to this Introduction to Culture Studies NPTEL course when we're reading Frantz Fanon. We have already started with Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Marks. We talked about the introduction in the last couple of lectures, Sardar's introduction and Pava's introduction. So what we'll do today, we'll dive right into the text. So we have in front of us on the screen the first chapter of this particular book. Is entitled The Negro and Language, where he talks about the discursive significance of language, the political significance of language, and more importantly, the relationship between language and agency in colonial conditions. So to what extent does language offer agency? To what extent is language invested in the entire politics of agency and embodiment in a colonial condition where obviously identities are unequal, identities are hierarchized, and identities are sort of played out across different political and racial parameters. As Fanon says, and this is on your screen, I ascribe a basic importance to the phenomenon of language. That is why I find it necessary to begin with the subject, which should provide us with one of the elements in the colored man's comprehension of the dimensions of the other. For it is implicit that to speak is to exist absolutely for the other. The black man has two dimensions, one with his fellows, the other with his white man. A Negro behaves differently with a white man and with another Negro. That a self-division is a direct result of colonialist subjugation is beyond question. No one would dream of doubting that this major artery is fed from the heart of those various theories that have tried to prove that the Negro is a stage in a slow evolution of monkey to man. So at the very outset, we have the tone of this particular book. It's a very provocative tone, it's a very angry tone. It's a tone which doesn't want to sort of conceal its resentment. So Fanon obviously uses this very resentful rhetoric in terms of looking at how colonial politics plays out, and the relationship between language and agency sort of is dramatized in a colonial scene, in a colonial agon, if you will. So at the very outset, it talks about the phenomenon of language, and then it talks about how the behavior of the black man changes depending on this location. The location of culture becomes important. So when he's in a company of other black men and he's in a company of the white man, the language changes, the embodiment changes, and this change of embodiment, this change of language, this change of behavior is obviously a result of violence, and violence stems from a systematic subjugation which happened during colonialism, during the time of colonial control. The subjugation of identities, violence, epistemic violence on identities, epistemic violence on ethnicities, on racial locations, and racial knowledge, etc., etc. So we talked about how, when we read Pava, for instance, we saw how knowledge can be extremely racialized, knowledge can be biopoliticized, and that obviously has a major replication, psychologically speaking, on the behavior of the black man. And just to reiterate what we have already said, Fanon is important for us today because he's one of the first philosophers, really, who looks at the collusion between medicine and race, and how this racialization of medicine, or the medicalization of race, whichever way you look at it, was a very handy instrument, a very important instrument in colonial control. And that obviously had its replications in the way the black man spoke to other black men and to the white men. Okay, and the last bit of this highlighted section is obviously very provocative, where he says that this entire idea of the subjugation of black men, the inferiority, the supposed inferiority of the black man, comes from the entire politics of theories, which included the theory that the black man or the Negro is a stage in a slow evolution of monkey to man. So classifying the Negro as a half human being, as a half man, and someone who's more sort of approximating humanity, and someone who's closer really to the monkey, is obviously one of the dominant theories of racism, especially the way it allied to imperialism. And that was obviously part of the plan in terms of theorizing the inferiority of the black man, which was a very handy theorization in colonial conditions. So and then Fanon talks about the politics of speaking. So to what extent is speaking of political activity, especially in a colonial condition where different languages are in conflict with each other. So you have this idea of hegemonic and dominant language, which obviously more often than not belongs to the colonizer, the colonial master, if you will. and we have the other language which belongs to the natives, which gets more and more violated, which gets more and more delegitimized in terms of its proximity to knowledge. So the language of power, the language of knowledge, the language of politics becomes by default the white man's language. And then Fanon says over here in the highlighted section, to speak means to be in a position to use a certain syntax, to grasp the morphology of this or that language, but it means above all to assume a culture, to support the weight of a civilization. So every language comes with the weight of civilization, every language comes with a certain culture. And obviously, as you saw, as we see already, having sort of looking at this particular text which you're covering in this course, that culture is a very loaded term. Culture includes material apparatus. Culture includes things like economy, finance, etc. But it also includes abstract apparatus, which are obviously in collusion with the material apparatus. So to speak is to assume a certain culture, to appropriate a certain culture, right? So the language in which you're speaking, the language which you're using to communicate yourself, that becomes a very important marker of your identity, marker of your embodiment, of your race, of your privilege, etc. So, and then he comes to this point where he says the Negro of the NPTEL will be proportionately whiter. That is, he will come closer to being a real human being in direct ratio to his mastery of the French language. So we come to this very provocative section where Fanon actually says there's a linear, direct correlation between your mastery, your skill with the colonizer's language, and your, you being considered as a human being. So a direct relationship is established over here by Fanon between language and agency. So you become more agentic in the colonial condition, depending on your mastery of the English language, so or the French language in this particular case, because you're talking about the French Algerian condition, the colonial condition, of course. So it's directly proportional to his mastery of the French language. So the more you master the French language, the closer you get in terms of looking at how you embody yourself. And so obviously, related to this idea of language, related to the idea of embodiment, is the innate idea of inferiority, the supposed idea of inferiority. And again, we battle the same question of looking at psychology and politics, psychology and political identities, because this idea of inferiority is obviously a construct, is obviously a very useful and successful construct which was created by a series of material and abstract apparatus during colonialism, including language, including knowledge, including law, including medicine, etc. And we just saw how, and Fanon will give more examples of how medicine was very conveniently used to racialize knowledge, to talk about racial divisions, racial hierarchies in terms of, conferring superiority to certain races and subjugating certain other races as inferior, etc. And then he goes on to say in his highlighted section where that every colonized people, in other words, every people in whose soul and inferiority complex has been created by the death and burial of its local cultural originality, finds itself face to face with the language of the civilizing nation. That is, with the culture of the mother country. The colonized is elevated to above this jungle status in proportion to its adoption of the mother country's cultural standards. So the more you appropriate, the more you approximate the cultural standards of the colonizing country, which is the mother country, the culture or the cultural parameters of the country become the gold standard, really, that you aspire to appropriate. And the more you appropriate that, the more successful you are in terms of appropriating that, the better you are as a human being, the more holistic human being you are. I mean, you find yourself elevated, you find yourself liberated. So there's a liberation quotient there, there is an agency quotient there, there is a privilege quotient there, which are all allied to this idea of appropriating culture, the mother country's culture, and we elevate it from the jungle. So the word jungle away is important because the black man and the black man society is described very conveniently as a jungle, as a space where civilization doesn't exist, because we're obviously looking at civilization from a very Eurocentric perspective, which becomes a universal perspective by default, right? So he becomes whiter as he renounces his blackness. So, we're looking at blackness and whiteness not just as races, not just as skin color. We just mentioned epidermalization yesterday in the last lecture, where we saw how the idea of the skin color becomes a discursive category, right? So blackness or whiteness become discursive categories over here, very interestingly. So blackness is obviously related to inferiority, related to lack of civilization, related to anarchy, related to savagery, and everything that comes with that kind of an assumption, whereas whiteness over here is just the opposite. It's the ontological opposite. It's civilization, it is order, it is logic, it is something which is, you know, which is worth aspiring for, which is privilege, etc. So the black man's whiteness depends on the extent to which the black man approximates the white man's culture, the white man's language. So we're talking about a very performative approximation over here, a very performative appropriation over here, which is something that happens a lot in colonial conditions. So in a French colonial army, and particularly in the Senegalese regiments, the black officers serve first of all as interpreters. They are used to convey the master's orders to their fellows, and they do enjoy a certain position of honor. So he talks about the subcategories inside space such as the army, the military, for instance, which is supposedly a mixed kind of people, where people from all kinds of backgrounds come. Now, he says in a French colonial army, the Senegalese people who know French, they have a position of agency because they are then used by the French officers to be the sort of interpreters between them and the people that don't know French. Something similar happened in the Indian context. If you remember, the very famous Macmillan Minutes on Indian Education, which is published, or which is first presented in the British Parliament in February 1835, which had this proposal that we should create this, men who are go-between, in between, who would serve as go-between us and the natives, which we, whom we desire to control. So, in other words, we create a certain creed of people who are Indians in race, Indians in blood, Indians in color, but British in temperament, right? And something similar is happening over here in a more micro category. We have a Senegalese army, French Senegalese army, obviously French being a colonizing nation over here. And in the army, the Senegalese people who know French, who happen to know French, they are the ones who enjoy a certain degree of privilege because they are used conveniently by the French officers and given certain honors, certain privileges in return of being interpreters between them and the other people who don't know French. Okay, so you're looking at the relationship between language and culture, language and agency over here, and it's a very important relationship because it directly relates to embodiment, it directly relates to identity. So what kind of identity are we talking about over here, right? What kind of idea of embodiment are we talking about over here? So embodiment over here is a way in which it is obviously a very psychological phenomenon. Embodiment, it's something to do with the body, it's something to do with the nerves, your muscles, your arteries, etc. But also it's quite discursive in quality. It's how you navigate yourself with the environment around you. And environment over here being the colonial condition, it's but obvious that embodiment will include and will be invested with your mastery of language, with your control of language, with the way you maneuver with language in a colonial condition. So and then Fanon goes on to say, on the basis of certain studies and my own personal observations, I wanted to try to show why the Negro adopts such a position peculiar to him with respect to the European languages. Let me point out that once more that the conclusions I have reached pertain to the French Antilles. At the same time, I'm not unaware that the same behavior pattern obtained in every race, patterns obtained in every race that has been subjected to colonization. So Fanon over here makes a claim that he's talking about obviously the French Antilles condition, but he is quite confident that this kind of a condition, this kind of a sense of inferiority, which is projected, which is injected into a certain population with obviously a strategic motive, a discursive motive, a political motive, is something which is true for every race that has suffered colonialism or colonization by another race. Okay, and then he goes on to say, I have known, and unfortunately I still know, people born in Dahomey or the Congo who pretend to be natives of the Antilles. I have known, and I still know, Antilles Negroes who are annoyed when they are suspected of being Senegalese. And this is because the Antilles Negro is more civilized than the African. That is, he's closer to the white man. And this difference prevails not only in black streets and boulevards, but also in the public service and the army. So this idea of being close to the colonizer, this idea of having some kind of a discursive proximity to the colonizer with the use of language, through the use of language, because you have the mastery of the language. So the language becomes the instrument which makes you closer, which gets you closer, which gets you a certain agentic status, and it becomes very important in a colonial condition, because that's why the anti-IELTS Negro, the anti-IELTS black man, as Fanon describes them, they seem to have a certain privileged section inside that entire demography of the colonized people. Okay, so even inside the colonized people, there's this hierarchization that happens, because depending on the proximity to the master narrative, the language of the colonizer. Okay, so again, we're back to this idea of privilege, of agency, of identity, and how everything comes together in terms of elevating yourself from your supposed inferiority. So again, inferiority over here becomes an ideology. It becomes a projected ideology, which is used conveniently to consolidate the superiority of the white man, of the colonizer. Okay, now Fanon would go on to give a series of examples of people who have published medical articles, medical journals, medical texts, which corroborate really the supposed inferiority of the African, where people actually say that the African suffers from inferiority or inferiority complex, a dependency complex. They have some kind of a need for a master, someone to come and rescue them, etc. But obviously we know that this is a very strategic kind of a discursive formation, using medicine, drawing in medicine, using a medical vocabulary with the purpose of legitimizing colonialism, legitimizing racism, or racialization of knowledge, racialization of difference, etc. So if we can medicalize it, if we can use a medical metaphor, if you can get published in a medical journal, you obviously empirically prove it through a quote-unquote scientific method. So science, medicine, medical knowledge all become very discursive in colonial conditions. And Fanon is one of the first people, one of the first thinkers who actually dramatized this discursivity of medicine, discursivity of knowledge. So he's a really profound and important philosopher for us today. Okay, so he mentioned someone called Dr. H.L. Gordon, who, attending a physician at the Mathare Mental Hospital in Nairobi, declared in an article entitled The East African Medical Journal in 1943, a highly technical and skilled examination of a series of 100 brains of normal natives has found a naked eye and microscopic facts indicative of an inherent new brain inferiority. Quantitatively, he added, the inferiority amounts to 14.8%. So this is really outrageously racist. But obviously, it's racist today because we know this is perhaps bogus knowledge, etc. But mind you, this was used as a very handy, convenient, and respectable knowledge in 1943 when this was originally published in this particular journal, where someone is actually quantifying the inferiority of the African. So you can see the extent to which this collusion between medicine and racism happens over here. So this quantifiability of inferiority becomes, to Fanon, in itself a discursive, a condition where you can actually quantify, you can put a number to the inferiority, you can put an index to the inferiority of the Africans. So there's actually a published article in 1943 which says that the inferiority complex amounts to 14.8%, right? So this is really how racism was medicalized and legitimized through the use of medical vocabulary. So, and then Fanon comes back and says again, it has been said that a Negro is a link between monkey and man, meaning, of course, white man. So, man over here is white man, man over here is a desirable man, a desirable humanity, which obviously is localized entirely in the white man, because the white man obviously becomes a symbol, the epitome, really, of civilization, of order, of logic, of rationality, of everything that's lofty in humanity. So the white man becomes, by default, the aspired figure, the signifier that people aspire for. And only on page 108 of his book, does Sir Alan Burns come to the conclusion that, and I quote, Fanon quotes away, we are unable to accept as scientifically proof the theory that a black man is inherently inferior to the white, or that it comes from a different stock. So there's a book that is referred to, as alluded to over here, a book by Sir Alan Burns, and only on page 108, it takes 107 pages to come to the conclusion that there is actually no scientific evidence which proves once and for all the inferiority of the black man, or the black man comes from a different stock from a white man. So again, we're looking at how racism was legitimized using medicine, and how there were sophisticated publications which are used in order to corroborate, really, consolidate and corroborate the discursive formation of the black man as inferior, the black man as the inferior by default, as someone who doesn't deserve civilization, as someone who needs to be civilized, as someone who needs to be rescued from his anarchy, from his wildness, from his savagery, etc. Now, next, Fanon moves on to a very interesting example of how language, or your skill of language, becomes can be racialized as well, because your inability to speak a certain language can obviously does definitely come from ignorance of the language. Now, Fanon looks at how this ignorance is racialized. So he talks about how if a German or a Russian cannot speak French, then obviously that's a different kind of issue. It's different from the way black man cannot speak French, because we assume that a German and a Russian has a language. They have a language. They have their own respective languages, and it's difficult for them to come out of the language and speak French. But the assumption that comes with the African or the black man is that the black man has no language at all. So the black man doesn't speak French. That means the black man actually doesn't have a language or cannot speak human language, right? So again, the ignorance of particular languages immediately racialized in this kind of a racist rhetoric that Fanon critiques in imperialism and racism and the collusion between racism and colonialism. And he actually says just on his screen, I meet a Russian or a German who speaks French badly with gestures that try to give him the information that he requests. So, Fanon says, Fanon speaks French, and he meets a Russian or a German who can't speak French at all, very badly, if any at all. And so Fanon would have to give information using gestures, using body language. But at the same time, I can hardly forget that he is a language of his own, a country, and that perhaps he's a lawyer or an engineer there. So not being able to speak French doesn't automatically make you agency less, doesn't automatically make your identity less. You still retain your identity as a Russian or a German or an Englishman or a Scottish or an Irish, whatever. And you cannot speak French at the same time be a respectable citizen in your own country. You can be an engineer, a doctor, someone who has a decent job, someone who's looked up to you socially speaking with social status. In any case, he is foreign to my group, and his standards must be different. So the question of relativity comes in, very, very conveniently when it comes to another white man who cannot speak French. So if a German can't speak French, the automatic assumption is a German doesn't know French, but he has a culture, he has his own language. It's just a question of not being able to acclimatize to the French language. However, there's no standard at all. There's no question of assuming language at all if a black man cannot speak French. If a black man cannot speak French, that means a black man cannot speak. He's not really human or not really civilized as a person. So when it comes to the case of the Negro, nothing of the kind. He has no culture, no civilization, no historical past. So the point is, this is what we call in colonial studies and post-colonial studies as erasure, E-R-A-S-U-R-E. So erasure is an act of obliterating any kind of civilization, any kind of culture which existed before colonialism. So, by saying that the black man doesn't have any language, the black man doesn't have any culture or any civilization, you're essentially enacting an erasure, right? E-R-A-S-U-R-E, an epistemic erasure. So you're doing away all kinds of knowledge which may have existed before this, the colonial people came in, before the white man came in, right? So willy-nilly, this is page 22 on your screen, willy-nilly, the Negro has to wear the livery of the white man had sewed for him. Look at the children's picture magazines. Out of every Negro mouth comes a ritual, yes sir, boss. It is even more remarkable that in motion pictures, most of the American films for which the French language is dubbed in offer of the type Negro show good. So, the Negro in popular culture, the representation of Negro in popular culture is always, depicted as someone speaking in very poor language, half-chopped language, someone who doesn't have any sophistication of expression, cannot master the European language, either speaks pidgin, either speaks some kind of a broken English or broken French, and that's something which is circulated and consumed across media, in films, in popular magazines, etc. Right, so this is the image of the white man has orchestrated for the Negro, for the black man. And again, we are back to sort of Edward Said's way of looking at Orientalism, in a way the projection is happening, where inferiority is projected onto the black man, and it becomes a very convenient projection because that determines and over-determines to a great extent the identity of the black man. So the black man is imprisoned in this inferiority, which is actually a construct, a fantasy of the European, of the white man. So this idea of fantasy and imprisonment and inferiority all come together and found a study over here where it examines the colonial condition in Algeria. So, and he goes on to say, and he'll now compare, very interestingly, anti-Semitism and racism, right? He talks about the racism directed against the black man and the anti-Semitism directed against the Jew, and how both create and construct stereotypes using certain kind of linguistic strategy, certain kind of racial strategy, certain kind of epidermal strategy. In the case of the black man, is more explicit because the black man is black, and so there's an immediate epidermalization that happens, which leads on to racism. The next natural step is racism, etc. And then he goes on to say, yes, the black man is supposed to be a good nigger. Once this has been laid down, the rest follows of itself. To make him talk pidgin is to fasten him to the effigy, to effigy of him, to snare him, to imprison him, the eternal victim of an essence, of an appearance for which he is not responsible. So it's the whole idea of making the black man speak in pidgin French, broken French, is to imprison him in this idea of inferiority, that a black man cannot speak in sophisticated language. So, to make a mummification of him, to mummify him, to completely reify him, to commodify him in his inferiority. He becomes the eternal victim of an essence, a stereotype. He becomes the victim of a stereotype, a permanent victim of an appearance for which he is not responsible. So again, he becomes more of a mimetic image, more of a mimetic signifier rather than a real human being who is complex, who has ambivalence. So the black man becomes just a shallow mimetic signifier, an appearance for which he is not responsible, is conferred to him, is projected onto him, and he has to enact it by default, and that's how it's represented in popular culture as well. And naturally, just as a Jew who spends money without thinking about it is suspect, a black man who quotes Montesquieu had better be watched. So again, this very racist stereotype of the Jew as being miserly, the Jew as being someone who is very, very stingy with money, someone who doesn't spend at all, someone who goats money, someone who basically steals other people's money and makes an empire out of it, which was a rhetoric used against Jews by the Germans, by the Nazi Party really, during the Second World War. They had essentially stolen all the German money by sort of pilfering it with their really dark businesses, with their really dodgy businesses. So the Jew is never known to spend any money. The Jew is always known to hold money, right? So the Jew who spends money without thinking is automatically suspicious, because that sort of goes against the stereotype of the Jew. So naturally and similarly, the black man who quotes Montesquieu had better be watched. So, if the black man is philosophizing something, is quoting something elegantly, that is something that needs to be watched out. Needs to be sort of, guarded yourself against. Right? So that's not natural. That's not the stereotypical representation of the black man at all. So that's something which goes against the grain. And then he goes on to say, what I'm asserting is that the European has a fixed concept of the Negro. So again, we're back to this Bhava's idea of fixity, right? So it is fixated, and at the same time, this fixity needs to be replicated over and over again, ad infinitum. And therein lies the ambivalence. So it is fixated, it's permanent. You can't change it, the inferiority of the Negro, but at the same time, that inferiority needs to be replayed over and over again across media, across discourses, across languages, etc., just to hammer home the point, just to make it more and more permanent. So therein lies the ambivalence of representation. So what I'm asserting is that the European has a fixed concept of the Negro, and there is nothing more exasperating than to be asked, how long have you been in France? You speak French so well. So this is obviously an example of covert racism. So there are different kinds of racism. There's overt racism, where someone is attacked racially in a very direct, explicit manner. There's also covert racism, where racism operates in more surreptitious, more sophisticated kind of ways, where you ask a black person, how come you speak French so well, and how long have you been in France? So the automatic assumption is that the black man should not be able to speak French well. The black man should just speak in broken French, just speak in pidgin French, because sophisticated French is beyond beyond the realm of the black man's abilities, of his neurotic abilities, his motor abilities, because of his superior inferiority. And it goes on to say it has become sort of darkly humorous. And he gives an example away. You're on a train and you ask another passenger, I beg your pardon, sir, would you mind telling me what the dining car is? So suppose you're a black man traveling on a train and you ask a fellow passenger, I beg your pardon, sir, would you mind telling me what the dining car is? And look at the response the Fanon gives away, which is what the response that he gets as a black man traveling across France. And this response is something along these lines. Sure, fellow, you go outdoor, see, go corridor, you go straight, go one car, go two car, go three car, you there. So the automatic assumption is the black man wouldn't understand sophisticated French, wouldn't understand, polite French. So the obvious thing to do is to reply to him in a way which is broken, which is more befitting the linguistic abilities of the black man. And so this presupposition is obviously racial, is obviously part of this racist rhetoric that the black man is inferior, knowledge-wise, linguistically. The black man cannot handle language, cannot maneuver language. So you better speak to him in a way which is understandable, broken, slow, and unmetaphoric, unfigurative, right? So, and then Fanon goes on to say, no, speaking pidgin nigger closes off the black man, right? So it perpetuates a state of conflict in which the white man injects the black with extremely dangerous foreign bodies. So again, he's using medical metaphors over here, and this is very interesting. It's almost like an injection which pathologizes the black man, an injection of foreign bodies into the body of the black man, the sense of inferiority, the sense of linguistic inability, the sense of linguistic inadequacy, etc. So nothing is more astonishing than to hear a black man express himself properly, for then, in truth, he is putting on the white world. So the black man expresses himself properly, then obviously he's becoming white. He's not being a black man anymore, because a black man by default should not express himself properly or elegantly. Elegance is in a domain of the white man. The whiteness and elegance are equated away in a very unproblematic kind of way. I've had occasion to talk with students of foreign origin. They speak French badly. Little Crusoe, alias Prospero, is at ease then. So he uses the metaphor of Crusoe and Prospero, two archetypal figures in white English literature of colonizers who come and control and rescue, quote-unquote, rescue the original natives, give them language, give them knowledge, etc. So Crusoe and Prospero here become metaphors of the archetypal white colonizer who comes and territorializes the non-white space, who comes and enacts epistemic violence on the non-white space, gives violence in terms of language, confers language, imposes civilization, imposes culture, etc. Now, those Crusoes and Prosperers, they're metaphors used by Fanon here, by the way. Those Crusoes and Prosperers are at ease completely with black men who speak badly, because they're meant to speak badly, because that's how black men are supposed to represent themselves, because the white man has given them the language. So obviously, language is something that have got from the white man. So they cannot possibly speak a language or speak in a language which is as elegant as a white man. So the black man can only speak in very stuttered, very pidgin kind of language, pidgin French or pidgin English. So as long as he's speaking that kind of language, broken, stuttered, fragmented, grammatically incorrect, etc., the Crusoes and Prosperers are completely at ease. Okay, he explains, interprets, informs, helps them with the study. So he becomes a benevolent colonizer. He's unthreatened, and hence the benevolence comes. So benevolence comes from not being threatened. So he's like completely at ease. The black man speaks like a black man should, fragmented, broken, etc. So the white man, out of kindness, out of racialized kindness, or superiority, this knowledge of superiority, helps the black man. But with the Negro, he's completely baffled. The Negro has made himself just as knowledgeable. With him, the game cannot be played. He's a complete replica of the white man, so there's nothing to do but to give in. So when it comes to foreign students, when it comes to other European students, then the French white man is completely at ease when they speak bad French. They're absolutely at ease as well when the black man speaks bad French. However, if the black man speaks perfect French, if the black man speaks French which is elegant and polite and sophisticated, then the problem comes. Then there's nothing to be done, because it totally goes against the grain, totally goes against the stereotype of the black man, which is obviously a construct of the white man's fantasy. So we just conclude this lecture today, but I think we're getting into this. The heart of the matter over here is how language is obviously agentic, how language is discursive in quality, how language comes with presuppositions of privilege, how language comes with performances of privilege, and how language comes with performances in racism, really. And all these presuppositions in language, which is heavily racialized, is something which Fanon examines throughout this particular book. And we'll continue with the study in the next lectures. Thank you for your attention.